3 years ago, I was a detective, the kind that lived for the chase, the thrill of piecing together the puzzle no one else could solve. But there was one case, the one that changed everything. A serial killer, meticulous, calculating, always one step ahead. I knew who he was, felt it in my bones, but proving it? That was another story. No evidence, no witnesses, no mistakes. He walked free, and I've been living in a nightmare ever since. It started with the little things. A shadow out of place, a car that seemed to follow me too long, a phone call with nothing but breathing on the other end. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was paranoia, the price of working too many late nights on a case that had gotten too personal. But then, it got worse. Much worse. My family, God, should have sent them away. I should have seen it coming. But I was stubborn, thinking I could handle it, that I could keep them safe. The first incident was a break-in at my home. Nothing was taken, but the place was trashed, my belongings scattered, a clear message, I can get to you anytime I want. Next came the letters. Handwritten, the same blocky script, taunting me. He described how he watched my wife while she was out shopping, how he stood outside my son's school, close enough to touch him. But he never did. That was the game. He wanted me to live in fear, to know he could destroy everything I loved but chose not to, because it was more satisfying to watch me crumble. And crumble, I did. My career was already in ruins, a detective who couldn't close the most important case of his life. The department had to let me go, too much liability, they said. I spent months holed up in my apartment, curtains drawn, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every ring of the phone. My wife begged me to let it go, to move on, but how could I? He was still out there, and he was coming for us. My mind started to unravel. I'd see him in crowds, his face in the windows of passing cars. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his smirk, that smug look that told me he was winning. The police, my old colleagues, didn't believe me. They thought I was imagining it, that I was so obsessed with the case I'd invented a phantom to haunt me. But I knew better. He was real, and he was savoring every moment of my descent into madness. My wife couldn't take it anymore. She left, taking our son with her. I don't blame her, I'd have done the same. But now, I'm alone, with nothing but my thoughts and the constant, gnawing fear that he's just outside, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The worst part is, I know he won't kill me. That would be too easy, too quick. He wants me to suffer, to lose everything, and then, when there's nothing left of me but a shell of who I used to be, then he'll make his move. Or maybe he won't. Maybe he'll let me live, haunted by the ghost of the man I once was, knowing I failed to protect the ones I loved. I keep a gun by my bed now, not that I think it'll do much good. He's too smart for that. But it gives me some sense of control, even if it's just an illusion. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The fear is eating me alive, and every day I slip a little further into the abyss. I was a detective once, a good one. Now, I'm just a broken man, hunted by a monster I couldn't stop. And I know, deep down, that there's no escape. This is my life now, a never-ending nightmare with no hope of waking up. The phone rang in the dead of night, shattering the uneasy silence that had become my constant companion. I'd been sitting in the dark, as I often did now, clutching the gun that never left my side. The sound of the ringtone sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, a sickening dread knotting in my stomach. I knew, even before I picked it up, that something was terribly wrong. It was my sister, her voice trembling, words tumbling out in a frantic rush. My niece, Ellie, sweet, innocent Ellie, was missing. She'd gone out with friends but never made it home. My sister's panic was palpable, her fear contagious. Ellie was more than just a niece to me, she was like a daughter. After everything else he had done, everything he had taken from me, this was the final straw. I told my sister to call the police, but I knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't some random abduction. This was him. The monster who had ruined my life had finally made his move, taking the one person left in the world that still mattered to me. My hands shook as I hung up the phone, the weight of my failure crashing down on me like a ton of bricks. The next few hours were a blur. I drove to my sister's house, my mind racing, my heart pounding. The police were already there, combing through Ellie's room, searching for clues. But I knew there wouldn't be any. He was too careful, too methodical. This was all part of his game. Then, the phone rang again. This time, it was my number on the screen, a blocked caller ID. I answered, my voice barely more than a whisper, and heard it, the voice that had haunted my nightmares for the past 3 years. I told you I wasn't finished, he said, his tone calm, almost conversational. She's with me now. I wonder how long it'll take for her to break. I wanted to scream, to threaten him, but the words caught in my throat. He laughed, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down my spine. You failed again, he continued. Just like before. But this time, there's no one left to save you. The call ended abruptly, leaving me standing in the middle of my sister's living room, numb with shock. I wanted to lash out, to destroy something, anything, to release the rage and helplessness that was consuming me. But I knew it wouldn't help. He had her, and there was nothing I could do but play his game. I spent the next few days in a haze, working with the police, following up on leads that went nowhere. My sister was a wreck, blaming herself for letting Ellie out of her sight, but I knew the truth, it was all on me. He had taken her to punish me, to drive the final nail into the coffin of my sanity. Then, the first package arrived. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, left on my doorstep in the middle of the night. Inside was a lock of Ellie's hair, tied with a ribbon I recognized from her favorite dress. The note was short, scrawled in that same blocky script, "Do you believe me now?" The second package came a day later, a recording this time. Her voice, trembling with fear, begging for help. My heart shattered as I listened, knowing I was powerless to save her. But the third package, the third was the worst. A photo, showing Ellie bound, her eyes wide with terror, and behind her, the killer. His face was masked, but I knew it was him. He was taunting me, showing me how close he was, how helpless I had become. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't let this go on. He had taken everything from me, but I wasn't going to let him destroy Ellie too. I made a decision, one that would either save her or end in tragedy. I was going to find him, alone, and this time, I wasn't coming back without her. I armed myself with everything I had, a desperate man with nothing left to lose. I scoured every lead, revisited every clue from the past 3 years, and finally, I found it, a small, abandoned cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. It was the perfect place to hide, the perfect place for him to finish what he had started. I drove out there, the night pressing in around me like a shroud. The cabin was dark, silent, but I knew he was inside. I could feel it, the same way I'd felt his presence all those years ago. My hands tightened around the gun as I approached the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I didn't. I couldn't. The door creaked open, revealing a room lit only by the dim glow of a single bulb. And there she was, Ellie, tied to a chair, her eyes wide with fear. Relief and terror washed over me in equal measure. I took a step forward, but before I could reach her, he appeared from the shadows, his smirk visible even in the dim light. "You finally made it," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let's see if you can save her this time." The room seemed to close in on me as I raised the gun, my hands shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. This was it, the final confrontation. The moment I had been dreading and anticipating for 3 long years. But just as I was about to pull the trigger, he moved, faster than I expected. There was a flash of metal, a sharp pain in my side, and then darkness. As I fell, the last thing I heard was Ellie's scream, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my days. When I came to, the cabin was empty. He was gone, and so was Ellie. The game wasn't over. It never would be, not until one of us was dead. I failed again, and now the nightmare continues. He's still out there, with Ellie, and I'm left with nothing but my guilt and the knowledge that this is all because of me. I've lost everything, but I won't stop. I can't. I'll hunt him to the ends of the earth, even if it kills me. Because now, it's not just about justice. It's personal. And I swear, if it's the last thing I do, I will make him pay. For a month, he played with my mind, pushing me closer to the edge with every passing day. The constant taunts, the eerie phone calls, the packages, each one designed to break me down piece by piece. Ellie's terrified face haunted my every waking moment, and the sound of her pleading voice echoed in my dreams. I was living in a hell crafted just for me, and it was working. I was losing my grip, inch by inch. Then, without warning, he sent me her location. It was another taunt, I knew that much. Why else would he give me what I wanted after so much torment? But I couldn't ignore it. The address was burned into my brain the moment I saw it, an old, decrepit warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you'd expect to find in the worst kind of nightmares. I drove there, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. The building loomed ahead, dark and ominous, every instinct screaming that it was a trap. But I didn't care. If there was even a chance that Ellie was inside, I had to take it. I'd already lost too much. I parked a block away, slipping through the shadows like a ghost, the gun heavy in my hand. The warehouse was silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I moved cautiously, every step deliberate, my senses on high alert. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay, and the only light came from the flickering bulb far at the end of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I saw her, Ellie, huddled in the corner, her face pale and gaunt. She looked up as I approached, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Uncle Daniel," she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. I rushed to her, pulling her into my arms, relief washing over me like a tidal wave. She was alive. She was safe. For now. But as I held her, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was too easy. The way he had played with me, tortured me for weeks, only to give her up like this, it didn't make sense. I scanned the room, my paranoia creeping back in. Where was he? Why hadn't he shown himself? And then, I understood. This was just another move in his twisted game. He wanted me to think I had won, to give me a false sense of victory before taking it all away again. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I got Ellie out of there as quickly as I could, every nerve in my body on high alert. We drove straight to my sister's house, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't leave her side, not for a second. He had already taken too much from me, and I wasn't going to let him take her too. My sister was in shock when we arrived, but she didn't ask questions. She knew what had happened, knew the hell I'd been living through. I told her I was staying with them, that I wasn't going to let Ellie out of my sight. She agreed without hesitation, her fear as palpable as mine. The days that followed were tense, every moment filled with the dread of what might come next. I set up makeshift security around the house, double-checked every lock, every window, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. He was out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And so, I wait too, on edge, knowing that the nightmare is far from over. He might have given Ellie back, but it was only to torment me further, to make me question every shadow, every sound. The game is still on, and this time, the stakes are higher than ever. But I won't let him win. I can't. My sanity might be slipping, but as long as Ellie is safe, I have something to hold on to, something worth fighting for. He might have taken everything else, but he won't take her. Not while I'm still breathing. I'm ready for him now, more than I've ever been. I just hope that when he comes, I'll be able to end this once and for all. Because if I can't, I don't know how much more I can take. The torment never stopped. It had been a twisted, relentless game of cat and mouse, and every time I thought I'd gained the upper hand, he was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again. First, it was Ellie, then Emily, and now, it was my mother. My heart sank when I realized he was going after the last person who still meant something to me. But this time, things were different. I had learned from my mistakes, and I was done playing by his rules. When the phone call came, it was the same as before, a blocked number, the same low, mocking voice. You've been busy, Daniel. But you can't protect everyone. Mommy dearest is next, and this time, there's no one to save her. His arrogance was palpable, dripping with the confidence of a predator who thought he had his prey cornered. But what he didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for weeks. The torment he had inflicted on me had sharpened my instincts, honed my resolve, and turned my fear into cold, calculated determination. I had set the trap, and he had walked right into it. The address he sent me was another isolated location, a dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town. I could almost hear the smugness in his voice as he told me where to find her, daring me to come, believing he had all the cards in his hand. But what he didn't know was that I had been tracking him for days. Every move he made, every place he visited, I was one step behind, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. I arrived at the farmhouse under the cover of darkness, the moon barely a sliver in the night sky. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating. But I was ready. This time, I wasn't the scared, desperate man he had been tormenting for the past 3 years. I was a hunter, and he was my prey. As I approached the house, I saw the faint glow of a single light in the window. My heart pounded in my chest, but it wasn't fear driving me this time, it was the thrill of the hunt, the anticipation of finally bringing this nightmare to an end. I moved silently, slipping through the shadows until I was right outside the door. I could hear him inside, pacing, his footsteps heavy with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. But he had underestimated me, just as I had once underestimated him. I took a deep breath and kicked the door open, my gun trained on the figure standing in the center of the room. But instead of the panic I expected to see in his eyes, there was only a cold, calculating smile. My mother sat tied to a chair in the corner, her eyes wide with fear, but unharmed. "So, you finally made it," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I was starting to think you'd given up. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because what he didn't know was that I wasn't alone. In the weeks leading up to this moment, I had been working in secret, gathering allies, people who had suffered because of him, people who wanted justice just as much as I did. The police, old contacts, even a few former criminals who had no love for a man like him, they were all in on it, waiting for my signal. The farmhouse was surrounded. I smirked, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he sneered, but there was an edge to his voice now, a hint of uncertainty. I stepped forward, my gun never wavering. "You've been playing your game for 3 years, I said, my voice steady, cold. But you forgot one thing, I learned from you." Before he could react, the lights outside the farmhouse blazed to life, and the sound of sirens filled the air. He spun around, realizing too late that he was trapped. I watched as the realization dawned on him, as the panic finally set in. You set me up," he stammered, taking a step back, his bravado crumbling. I nodded slowly. "You were always so sure of yourself, so certain you could outsmart me. But you made one mistake, "You underestimated how far I was willing to go to end this." He tried to make a run for it, but the door burst open behind him, and the police swarmed in. He struggled, fought, but it was over. He was done. They dragged him out in cuffs, the look of defeat etched into his face, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long. My mother was safe. My family was safe. The nightmare was finally over. I walked outside, breathing in the cool night air, the weight of the past 3 years lifting off my shoulders. The police were taking him away, and as I watched, I knew I had finally won. Not just the battle, but the war. This time, it wasn't me who was broken. It was him. And as I turned to walk back to my mother, I knew that the shadows that had haunted me for so long were finally gone. The hunter had become the hunted, and justice had been served. Checkmate. Story 2. The Last House on Elm Street. When we moved to Elm Street, the neighborhood seemed perfect. The houses were charming, the lawns pristine, and the people unerringly friendly. It was the ideal place for a fresh start after Claire and I decided to escape the city's chaos. Yet, from the moment we pulled into our new driveway, an unsettling chill lingered in the air. The previous owners had left abruptly. Their belongings were scattered in the attic, and the basement was cluttered with dusty remnants. Most disconcerting was the portrait in the living room, an old woman with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the room. "Just an old painting," I told Claire, trying to mask my own unease. "We'll get used to it." Claire didn't seem convinced. "I don't know. There's something off about this place." On our first night, I was jolted awake by faint whispering. It sounded like a distant rustle but was persistent. I dismissed it as house settling or neighborhood noise. As days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and seemed to emanate from the very walls. Claire, however, was deeply affected. She saw shadowy figures in her peripheral vision and woke with unexplained bruises and scratches. Her sleep grew fitful, and she became increasingly withdrawn. Concerned, I spoke with Mrs. Thompson, the elderly neighbor next door, who had lived on Elm Street for decades. Her eyes were shadowed with worry as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a reason this house was vacant for so long," she said, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "The land it's built on was part of an old cemetery. The graves were moved, but some things refused to leave." I frowned. "What do you mean by some things?" Mrs. Thompson's gaze grew intense. "Not just graves. Sometimes, when the dead are disturbed, their restless spirits linger. And the worst of them, they're not ghosts. They're entities that hunger for the living." "What kind of entities?" I asked, feeling a shiver down my spine. Mrs. Thompson's voice lowered even further. "Primordial beings, ancient forces of hunger and darkness. They feed on the living to grow stronger." She handed me a weathered photograph showing a line of graves with crude wooden crosses. The house we now lived in loomed ominously in the background. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved into the local library's archives. The records revealed that the house had been constructed over cemetery grounds and that numerous residents had reported disappearances and unexplained phenomena. One entry stood out: the last family vanished, leaving behind a diary detailing an entity that had claimed them. It is said that the entity is a primordial being, a force of hunger that feeds on the living to sustain itself. That night, Claire and I decided to leave. We packed hurriedly, but the car refused to start. Desperation set in as the whispers turned into a cacophony of screams. The temperature plummeted, and we were trapped. Claire's screams echoed through the house. I found her in the basement, surrounded by a circle of candles that had ignited on their own. The whispers had become a deafening roar, and dark, writhing shapes slithered along the walls. Claire was in a trance, her eyes vacant, her body convulsing uncontrollably. I grabbed her, trying to shake her out of it. "Claire, we need to get out of here." But as I pulled her, the house seemed to fight back. The floors cracked open, and walls bled a dark, inky substance. The house was alive, pulsating with a malevolent force. Just as we reached the front door, it slammed shut. Mrs. Thompson stood there, her face twisted into a malevolent grin. Her eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction. "You were never meant to leave," she said, her voice echoing with sinister delight. "My family's task was to ensure the entity's hunger was never sated. And now, you've become a part of it." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, panic rising as the house continued to crumble. "The entity is an ancient force, a being that predates time itself. It was bound to this land by my ancestors. But every time it feeds, it grows stronger. Your presence has only made it more powerful. What do you want from us?" Claire cried, struggling to break free from my grip. Mrs. Thompson's smile widened. "It needs fresh souls. You fed it, and now it demands more. The more you resist, the stronger it gets." The house continued to disintegrate around us. The walls closed in, and Mrs. Thompson's laughter echoed through the chaos. Her figure merged with the darkness, leaving only her disembodied voice cackling. Claire and I fought our way through the debris, the entity, a monstrous, shapeless mass, pursuing us with relentless fury. We stumbled into the woods, the entity's presence growing more oppressive with every step. Its hunger felt like a physical weight, suffocating and crushing. By dawn, we reached the edge of the forest, and the entity seemed to dissipate with the first light. The house, now a smoldering ruin, was a dark scar on the land. We tried to report the incident, but the authorities found only a charred pile of rubble. The records and photographs I had collected mysteriously vanished. To this day, I hear the whispers sometimes, especially when I'm alone. The entity wasn't vanquished, it was merely displaced. It could be anywhere, lying in wait for its next opportunity to feed. Elm Street was abandoned, and the land was eventually sold off. No one knows what happened there, and I hope it stays that way. But if you ever hear whispers on Elm Street or see shadows moving in the corners of your vision, remember, some things are better left buried.